Hello, everybody. Welcome to another Login VSI Vision 2022 session by me, Blair Parkhill. And in this session, we're going to cover the hidden problems of collaboration tools. As I mentioned, my name is Blair Parkhill. I'm a digital nomad, which means I roam all over the place. I am a remote work enthusiast and do enjoy, being able to, flex my travel muscles. But I also enjoy the problem solving. Where am I going to log into when I reach my destination? Where can I find a good signal to do all of this? And today, I'm going to be presenting to you from Los Angeles, California, here in the United States, and I'm looking forward to that. I'm at Login BSI. I'm on the Systems Engineering and Strategic Partnerships team. I've been spending a lot of time working with Microsoft and their Azure Virtual Desktop platform, and lately I've been working on a project that revolves around Microsoft Teams, which is a unified collaborations tool or communications tool, and certainly has piqued my interest in the unified communications platforms. Now, with that said, being a remote worker, I do tend to use a number of different UC platforms to stay engaged with the people that I'm working with, whether it's in my own company or working with other companies. As you can see on the graphic, I have been using quite a number of different UC platforms to stay engaged with our customers and internally. You can see the green circles are ones that I've used over the last year lightly, not a whole lot. And I expect many of you to also share, the a common use case. Now, Zoom and Microsoft Teams are the ones that I use the most and have used the most in this year. But clearly, Microsoft Teams, not only are they a leader in the Gartner Magic Quadrant for UCaaS, but they are a choice of my company that I work for, Login VSI. And I've found that it's become critical for me to stay engaged with the folks in my company to use Teams. In a number of different ways. So, not only am I using it to stay connected with folks in my company, but also I'm using it to stay engaged with the people that I'm working with. And I'm also using it in tests that I'm doing. And I'll share some of that information with you today. If you were in my last session, the research insights for Azure Virtual Desktop, we did share some of my performance insights around Teams, which have been pretty interesting. So, but when it comes to unified communications as a service, we're just getting started on things like performance and reliability, and testing all of that, and really being able to get our arms around how we size and make sure that we're providing a great end user experience to those. We are receiving a lot of requests from a lot of our customers about, hey, help me to characterize the UC platform that I'm using in the VDI environment that I choose to use. So really, it's been great stuff. I actually use it on all of my phone, my laptops, and I've lately have been using Cloud PC or Microsoft 365 or Windows 365 on Microsoft Azure as my new PC, and have actually accidentally done meetings from that one where I thought I was on my own laptop, but the experience was so good, I couldn't really tell that I wasn't on my own laptop and I was actually using Windows 365. So it was pretty cool. And the technology behind that has certainly been very interesting. Now, why has unified communications as a service become so important now? Well, number one, we had the pandemic. Many of us are working from home, and so we are heavily reliant on these platforms to stay engaged and productive with our companies. And also, a number of enterprises that have deployed their solutions on-prem are now faced with the reality of a hardware refresh. And if I'm kind of balancing, okay, do I want to refresh and take on all of this unified communications infrastructure and the limited number of features that may be with that platform versus something like unified communications as a service with Teams or some of these others, um, you know, That's just basically enabling that in the cloud. And if you're already using Office 365 or Microsoft 365, you've got the ability to use Teams. So why not do that versus reinvesting a bunch of capital? So we are seeing a huge exodus away from those on-prem solutions to more of the cloud-based solutions that are very feature rich. But ultimately, when it comes to these platforms, it all comes down to us at the endpoints, the users, and we need to be able to adopt it. We need to feel comfortable with it. We need to feel like it's serving us. And that includes things like performance and reliability, and also the features that we're going to be using that platform for. So, pre-pandemic for me, I was a remote worker. I've been a remote worker for almost 8 years now. It was a tough switch at first. But what I found was in an office type of environment, I'd be spending a lot of time conversing with my peers, which is great, right? But what if I'm head deep, knee deep into a project, and I'm on a really good flow. I'm mid thought on something, and somebody stops by and has a question for me, right? I'm not great about closing my door, and I have a very slim attention span. So, in a business type of environment where I'm in the office, these interruptions happen a lot, and I find that I'm less productive, which is kind of counterintuitive because when you move out of a very productive, office location to, let's say, a beach or maybe mountains, both of which I find myself working from on a continuous basis, I think the benefits, for me at least, are that I get more done because I'm not interrupted as much. I'm feeling less stressed, and I have these tools in front of me that allow me to be engaged with everybody that I work with on a daily basis, which is just invaluable. So, what is unified communications? Let's put a little wrapper around that first and kind of keep that in context. So, unified communications is number one, it's becoming business critical. It's no longer a nice to have, it's a need to have. And the most common features are chatting and collaborating, right? That's something that we use our phones for, our laptops for, and it's something that we use many, many times during a day. I mean, tens, if not hundreds of times during a day to stay in touch and to do things productively. Having a quick chat, getting a quick answer is much more productive than diving into a full conversation, for example. Video and audio conferencing is another example of UC. And this is something, again, we will find ourselves doing on a daily basis, either, one-on-one or with multiple peers at the same time. Next is presence, and a lot of us don't really associate that with UC, but presence is, an important thing. Sometimes it feels like it's a bit intrusive, but presence is important. That's basically a UC's platform to understand: is this person, actively available? Are they engaged? Do they need to, be left alone for a little bit? This presence feature is certainly very helpful in terms of choosing a resource to engage with, to get quick answers and collaborate with. And then shared screen collaboration, very important as you share, your digital content. And then lastly, live events like the one you're attending today. All of the platforms that you saw in the Gartner Magic Quadrant typically have live event, availability. And certainly that's very important. So as we become more reliant on unified communications, we also have to understand that just like any technology, there are problems lurking around the corner. Now, understand that my perspective might be different than a typical architect or IT admin, right? I'm coming from the perspective of somebody that tests VDI and tests UC platforms now in the context of performance. So I see things a little bit differently, but I think because I kind of dive into those bottlenecks and the technology around this, I might have an interesting perspective. So um, bear with me. So when unified communications isn't working, it definitely will slow the business down. I know, if you've got an issue, I know I was part of a UC platform where the license wasn't kept up to date and had lapsed on accident. And it only lasted for about 8 hours. But during that 8 hours, I couldn't contact any of my peers. And mail is just such a slow, and it also doesn't provide any feedback, right? It's a it's something you send a mail and just, you never know if the person's getting it or not. With UC, you do, right? So that when you don't have your UC platform available to you, you almost feel isolated and certainly don't feel productive. And can come in the form of things like dropped calls, disconnected webinars. Now, let's pray that that doesn't happen today. I'll knock on plastic, or hopefully there's wood under there. But again, this can be counterproductive. Now, there's some other things too, and this kind of takes on that hidden aspect that we alluded to in the title, right? Missing features from one platform when you're used to another, perhaps, right? Things like blurred backgrounds become pretty important, or being able to share multiple screens, things of that nature. If I'm going from one platform to another, then, and I'm missing a feature, I might find myself, unprepared. And as we'll discover, there are other reasons that may lead to us not having certain features that we're used to, having at our discretion. Now, of course, there are some of the more obvious things like hackers that can jeopardize the system, certain vulnerabilities around the software that we're using. So all of these things are things that we need to keep in mind as those hidden vulnerabilities and protect ourselves against. And I'll cover some of these things with you. Now, again, because we operate that Login VSI heavily in a VDI or virtual desktop type of environment to help our customers measure and understand the impacts of any changes that they may have, then, and when you combine UC and VDI, there are certainly more things in that technology stack that can lead to an unfavorable type of experience. And things that lead to that are like more network hops, right? If I've got a hop from my endpoint to my session host, or my environment where my desktop is being hosted, and hop from that to the other peer that I might be working with, more hops through the network means increased latency, right? And there are many different types of endpoints too that we use in VDI that wouldn't traditionally be used. Like, today we use phones and laptops a lot, but what about things like iGel endpoints, for example, right? Or these thin clients that we have. All of these are typically in the context of VDI. So we have to consider, are they giving me everything that I need as well? But there's also new technology that helps to make all of this kind of a moot point, and I'll share some of that with you as well. There are a few things that we're going to look at quickly in the time that we have, and that is performance, user experience, and security. So let's hop right into performance. Now, the question is UC impacting my performance? And of course, just like any application, UC applications will consume system resources, and that is compounded by the fact that I'm putting a bunch of stuff into VDI. And there are several factors that can change that performance profile. Some of those things are the type of install that I might be using, right? You can either install your UC, it can either be Teams or Zoom, or GoToMeeting, whatever any of these are. You can install them locally on your laptop or your machine, even in your virtual machine, and it behaves just like any other software in that case. But there are also, in the context of, session host types of infrastructure, where you can do a machine-wide or per user install. Um, and also, you can use these platforms typically via a browser. So all of these different types of installs and use cases present to you, a mix of different features and things that you have to be aware of. Another thing is, how is it started? I know that if I do a machine-wide install with Teams, for example, in AVD, then Teams is typically going to be automatically installed, and it's going to be set to auto start by default, which means that every time a user logs in, Teams has to take some resources to start up as well. Of course, that could be configured to not behave that way, and sometimes you may want to do that. And then lastly, offloading of audio and video, which is a fascinating new technology today on these platforms, which I'm very excited about. Now, let me give you an example of some of the testing that I've been doing, because this has been a popular request from a lot of our customers. And in this case, what I was doing was I was testing the impact from a performance perspective of Teams, in conjunction with a knowledge worker workload. So that's basically a virtual user using all of the Office applications, browsing the web with Edge, but then we add Teams on top of that. And I wanted to see what's the performance different when I add Teams to that workload. And I'm using a popular instance called the D16 DSV4. That's an Azure instance. It's general compute. It's great for VDI. And so what I found was when I didn't have Teams running and didn't have the virtual user using Teams, that my EUX or my end user experience was typically higher, than it was when I had Teams on. Because I'm using more resources, the system becomes a little more laggy or latent. And we found that it had a drop of about 11% in the end user experience. So this is something that a user will typically feel. It doesn't mean they have a terrible experience, but it does mean that they will notice if they didn't have Teams on it before and now they're running Teams, they will notice that it's slowed down. And the reason for that is typically, again, system resources. So CPU utilization at steady state, that means after they're all logged on and running in steady state, we found that it was about a 33% increase in CPU utilization on this platform. And then from a memory perspective, about a 20% increase in utilization by adding teams for the same number of users. And you can see how this behaves a little bit too. If you look at the graph that I have in there, the bottom blue line that tends to sweep down and then back up and then back down, that's the end user experience with Teams installed. Without, you can see once they log on, the system tends to be pretty stable and flat with an end user experience score of 7.2. But you also see when I log in with Teams that the end user experience drops pretty significantly, but then it comes back up. Now, that drop has to do with the number of resources used to not only start the Windows operating system or the Windows environment for that user, but also because Teams is now starting up and being logged into. So that's, again, that compounding effect on performance. Now, if I was faced with this situation and I had to stick with the same session host and I didn't want my users to feel that drop in performance, I would probably take Teams and set that so that it did not auto start, so that only the users that were going to use Teams, they could start that manually and then be on their way. And that would certainly help with that logon interval. Some other examples outside of Azure Virtual Desktop and Teams comes from Citrix. And you can see they did some work and looked at what's the overhead of using Teams in a Citrix VDI environment. And you can see they're fairly similar to mine. It's about a 40% scalability impact when they look at how many users can I pack on the system and keep it at the same CPU utilization. And you could see that just comparing apples to apples, it was about a 40% difference, plus or minus in CPU. If you remember the last slide, it was about 33. 20% extra memory required. That's exactly what we saw in my testing on the last slide. And then they also give some insight into the storage and some of the impact of storage. You can see I have a link down there. So if you'd like to learn more on that, you certainly can. But as you can see, when we start to include teams in these VDI environments, it does, provide, an impact in that performance profile. Now, there's this great new technology that we call media optimization in general, and that's how do we deal with audio and video in the context of VDI, because audio and video certainly requires a lot of processing power, but how do we offload that from the VDI session hosts and the VDI environment and put that work on the client or the endpoint that we're sitting in front of today? And so what we're finding is that when things are optimized, certainly that's going to be better for the hosts and the VDI pools, and also for that user experience. But if, for example, you're not in this media optimized mode and you have to fall back to a non-optimized mode, that may put more pressure on those hosts and that VDI session pool, and certainly impact your scalability and user experience. And if you're not aware of that and you don't test that out and you don't know how that's going to impact your scalability, you could end up with a bunch of tickets, support tickets, because your users are facing a laggy and not a very good user experience with not only Teams or these UC platforms, but also the applications that they're using. So really important. And so I want to kind of point out the WebRTC part of this, right? WebRTC is, I believe it comes from, a Google background. And basically what WebRTC is, now imagine you're in VDI and you've got hundreds of sessions going against the session host. And if you have 100 sessions and all of them are using Teams, you can imagine what that impact is going to be like. But what WebRTC does is it basically provides us with the shell of Teams. So basically think of Teams without any audio or video. You just have a window there that's empty. That's what VDI is providing to the endpoint. But now with WebRTC, what the endpoint can do, as you see here with the P2P audio video, that empty shell, right, that audio and video in Teams is now being filled by this WebRTC technology. So when I'm communicating with one of my peers, all of that audio video is going directly between us while the shell is being hosted by the VDI environment. So this optimization is huge. Not only does it mean I get to unload that burden from the session host, but I also get a much better experience as a user, which is great. So I put a couple of links there if you'd like to learn a little more about that. I think it's really valuable information. Now, in terms of media optimizations, I think it's important to look at features. Here's another area where these hidden things can cause issues, right? These features are important because they can mean, it being an embarrassing situation versus, a less embarrassing situation. If this chap would have had Teams and had the background blur available, then he might not have had this embarrassing situation happen between him, and could have carried on without any interruption there. So these features are becoming more and more important, especially when we're at home and we don't have the good fortune of having a pretty environment behind us that's not busy. So features are very important when it comes to these platforms. And when you're not in these optimized modes, you're going to be lacking some of these features. Now, the virtualization platform certainly matters. So if the most common ones are typically the ones that will bring you these optimized modes. So that's VMware with their Horizon product, Citrix with their virtual apps and desktops products, and then obviously Azure Virtual Desktop, which is something that I've been using lately. So these most popular ones are the ones that most of the UC platforms will support and provide these media optimization features for. If you're not using those platforms, then be aware that you may not be getting the best out of your UC platform. Um, I put the Ring Central example here just to show, um, that in certain environments like Azure Virtual Desktop, they may only support one type of client. Now we have web clients, we have, the standard clients that we use, and each of those provides a different experience as well. So no matter what UC platform you're using, if you're using it in the context of VDI, there's probably going to be, an example of where you might be limited, within that VDI environment. Here's an example of Teams. This is documentation that comes from Microsoft that talks about, if you're in a VDI environment, what types of things don't you get or can you expect to be limited until they can provide those features later through more technology. So this first bullet is, doesn't support creating live events. Now, I know they have a multimedia redirection technology that's in preview right now that helps to resolve this issue, but this is just an example of some of the limitations that you can expect, whether it be resolution, can I share certain applications, or can I put custom backgrounds behind me? All of these things become more and more important. And so no matter what you're using, definitely do some research into seeing, do I get all of the features that I need? Now, how do I know if Teams, for example, or my UC platform is media optimized? Like I said, I've been working with Teams a lot. First of all, be aware that depending on how you're connecting to your Azure Virtual Desktop environment determines whether or not you get to take advantage of that media optimization. And right here, you can see that you only get it if you use two types of clients. One is the Windows Remote Desktop client, um, and the other is Mac OS Remote Desktop Client. So that's their latest desktop client. If you're using the old Microsoft, remote connection software to connect to that, you're not going to get any of the media optimizations. Or if you're using an HTML5 client, you won't be getting any of those optimizations. So that's important to note. Now, you can see on the Teams platform or the Teams application behind this note from Microsoft, if you notice up towards the search bar, there's a gray bar that goes across there that says you have a certain Microsoft Team version and whether or not it's AVD optimized. So whether you're using AVD or Citrix or VMware, typically you're going to see this in Teams, and it's going to tell you if you pop open the version of Teams, it will not only show you the version but also whether or not it's media optimized. So very quickly you can determine, is the infrastructure I put in place going to be benefiting my end clients? And then also the features. This is an example of Zoom, right? And the endpoints that they support. You can see that on Windows across the board, Citrix, VMware, and AVD, it's supported, but not for Mac. For iGel across the board and some of these others, it's supported these optimization modes. So just keep in mind that it's a complex environment, and certain things will give you certain features. Here's another example of Zoom. Here's another one. Dual monitor mode is only supported with the desktop client, not the VDI client or the web client. More on Teams, what you get if you use a browser versus the desktop client. All of the stuff is documented. It's rather easy to find if you're doing a search. And then lastly, these hidden things. So let's just quickly bring up security considerations. So these are the common security threats: compromised key attack, eavesdropping, man in the middle. SPIM, I think, is really interesting. That's basically spam over IM, viruses and worms, all things that we're used to on a daily basis. But when you have, UC in there, you've got a larger surface that can be attacked. So things that this just reinforces the point that we need to stay updated with these applications and make sure they stay secure. Now, these UC platforms are not, without their own types of vulnerabilities, right? And a lot of us were using Zoom as the pandemic started, and I'm sure many of you remember that there was a vulnerability in Zoom, and all of a sudden, we were worried: is somebody else going to hijack our session? Are there going to be people lurking out there on our meetings that we don't want, using our cameras, things like that? So it's really important to stay up to date. And if you look at Teams, you can see that they're updating every month. Not only are they adding more security features, but they're also adding regular features, which can change the way that the product is used. And then lastly, one more point that I'd like to bring up is, again, the way that the UC platform is installed on the session host. In my case, again, we're doing a lot of Teams testing on AVD. And as I mentioned earlier, Teams can be installed on a session host in machine-wide install. Now, when we do this, again, it installs it for all users. And if I do a machine-wide install, I have to know that Teams does not automatically update. And any other client version of Teams, it's going to automatically update when you're not using Teams, right? When you kind of go get a coffee or something, Teams will say, "Hey, the system is not being used. Let me update real quick," and it will automatically do that, and you don't have a choice. But if it's a machine-wide install, you're not going to get that benefit. So you have to stay on top of getting Teams up to date if you're using something like a machine-wide install. So just a heads up on that one, right? So I realized we didn't have a ton of time today, about 25 or 30 minutes, but hopefully I was able to share some good information with you that may have opened your eyes in some of the areas you weren't looking at when it comes to UC as a service. So I want to thank you so much for joining me. Please enjoy the closing keynote with Greg Brown, and the session that is after this one. So I really appreciate your attendance today and hope you all have a good one. Enjoy yourselves and be good. Stay well. Thanks for joining.